"You ruined my youth," she'd often say, looking at me with disgust. But I thought it was just anger, until I found the letter where she begged to give me away to foster care. Growing up, those words were like a soundtrack to my childhood. Every morning, I'd wake up hoping today would be different, that maybe she'd look at me the way other moms looked at their kids. Instead, I got those cold stares and the constant reminders that I wasn't wanted. The house always felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with resentment. She'd slam dishes in the kitchen while making breakfast, and I learned to eat quietly, quickly, trying not to draw attention to myself. When friends from school would invite me over, I'd make excuses because I was too embarrassed to have them see how she treated me. Their moms would ruffle their hair and ask about their day. Mine would barely acknowledge I existed unless it was to point out how I'd supposedly ruined something else. School became my escape. I'd stay late in the library, volunteer for extra credit projects, anything to avoid going home. The librarian, this older woman with kind eyes, never asked why I was always there until closing time. She'd just nod when I'd ask to help organize books or clean the computers. Sometimes she'd leave an extra sandwich from her lunch on the table where I usually sat. I pretended not to notice her doing it, and she pretended it was just leftover. At home, every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. If I got good grades, she'd say it was the least I could do after everything she'd sacrificed. If I struggled with something, it was proof that I was just another burden she had to carry. When I made the soccer team in middle school, I was so excited to tell her. I ran home, still sweating from tryouts, and burst through the door with the biggest smile. She was sitting at the kitchen table, paying bills, and when I told her the news, she didn't even look up. Just said it would cost money we didn't have for equipment and gas to drive me to games. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was how normal it all felt after a while. You start to believe that's just how things are, that maybe you really are the problem. I'd lie awake at night trying to figure out what I could do differently, how I could make her happy, make her love me the way I saw other parents love their kids. High school was when things got really dark. She started drinking more, and the comments became sharper, more personal. She'd compare me to other kids, telling me how much easier their parents had it. When I brought home a report card with mostly A's and one B, she focused on that B for weeks. When I got my first job at 16, bagging groceries at the local market, she immediately started calculating how much I should contribute to household expenses. That job was actually a blessing, though. My manager was this guy in his 30s who had this calm way about him. He never raised his voice, even when customers got nasty. He'd just handle things smoothly and move on. Watching him taught me that not all adults were angry all the time. Some of my coworkers became like an adopted family. We'd joke around during slow periods, and they'd ask about school, my plans for the future. Nobody there knew about my home situation, and for those hours each day, I could pretend to be a normal teenager. I started saving every penny I could. Not for anything specific at first, just because having money felt like having options. I'd stash cash in an old shoebox under my bed, counting it sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep. It grew slowly but steadily, and with it grew this tiny seed of hope that maybe someday I could leave. The summer before my senior year, she had one of her worst episodes. I'd come home from work, tired and just wanting to shower and sleep, and she was waiting in the living room with this look I'd never seen before. Pure hatred. She started screaming about how I thought I was so much better than her, how I acted like I was too good for this house. The things she said that night were so cruel, so specific, that I knew she'd been thinking them for a long time. She didn't just dislike me in that moment. She'd been building up this resentment for years. I spent that night walking around the neighborhood, just trying to process what had happened. When I came back, she was passed out on the couch, and I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's house for a few days. His parents didn't ask too many questions, just made sure I had enough to eat and a place to sleep. When I finally went home, we didn't talk about it. We just went back to the usual routine of avoiding each other. Senior year flew by in a blur of applications and planning. I'd gotten into a state school about 3 hours away, far enough to feel free, close enough that I could still work part-time jobs during breaks if I needed to. The day I got my acceptance letter, I didn't even tell her right away. I just sat in my room, holding that piece of paper, feeling like I was holding a ticket to a different life. Graduation was awkward. She came, sat in the back, left right after the ceremony without saying congratulations. Some of my friends' families invited me to their celebration dinners, and for a few hours, I got to feel what it might be like to have people be proud of you. College was everything I'd hoped it would be. For the first time in my life, I could make choices without someone telling me how those choices were wrong or selfish. I could eat what I wanted, sleep when I was tired, hang out with friends without having to explain myself. My roommate was this easygoing guy who played guitar and was studying music. He'd practice in our room sometimes, and I'd do homework to the sound of him working through songs. It was peaceful in a way I'd never experienced. I didn't call home much that first semester. She'd call me occasionally, usually late at night, and the conversations were always the same. She'd tell me about neighbors I barely remembered, complain about money, and somehow work in comments about how much easier her life was with me gone. I'd listen, say the right things to keep the conversation short, and hang up feeling drained. Update 1. Things started getting weird during my sophomore year. She began calling more often, and the tone was different. Instead of the usual complaints, she'd ask about my classes, my friends, what I was eating. At first, I thought maybe she was actually trying to connect, that distance had given her some perspective. I'd tell her about my studies, about how I joined the campus radio station and was learning to run sound equipment. She seemed interested, asked follow-up questions. But then the conversation started lasting longer. She'd keep me on the phone for hours, talking about her day in excruciating detail. How the cashier at the grocery store was rude, how the neighbors were too loud, how work was stressing her out. I'd try to end the calls politely, but she'd always find another topic to bring up. My roommate would give me sympathetic looks as I'd pace our small room, trapped in these marathon phone sessions. The really strange part was how she started talking about the past. She'd bring up memories from when I was little, but her version was completely different from what I remembered. She'd talk about how we used to have such good times together, how close we were. I'd listen confused, because I couldn't remember any of those moments. In her stories, I was this happy kid who loved spending time with her, and she was this devoted mother who sacrificed everything for my happiness. During winter break of that year, I came home for a few weeks. The house felt smaller than I remembered, and she was different too. More clingy, more emotional. She'd made my favorite dinner the night I arrived, except it wasn't actually my favorite. It was something she liked that she'd convinced herself I loved. She kept touching my arm when we talked, something she'd never done before, and it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. She had this photo album out on the coffee table, filled with pictures of me as a kid. I couldn't remember her ever taking most of these photos, let alone keeping them in an album. She'd flip through the pages, telling stories about each picture, and again, her memories didn't match mine at all. In her version, every moment was precious, every milestone was celebrated. I sat there nodding, but inside I felt like I was listening to someone else's childhood. The strangest part was how she kept apologizing. Not for specific things, just these vague apologies about being a young mother, about how hard it was to raise a child alone, about wishing things had been different. But even her apologies felt wrong somehow, like she was apologizing for circumstances rather than for her choices. She'd tear up and talk about how much she missed me, how quiet the house was without me. I started feeling guilty for enjoying college so much, for being happy away from her. Maybe I'd been too harsh in my memories. Maybe she really had been trying her best, and I'd just been too young to understand how hard things were for her. I began second-guessing everything I remembered, wondering if my own perspective had been skewed by teenage angst and resentment. When I went back to school after that break, I made more effort to call her regularly. I'd tell her about my classes, my friends, funny things that happened on campus. She seemed so grateful for these conversations, so hungry for connection. Part of me started to think that maybe we could have a real relationship now that I was older, now that I was out of the house and we weren't stepping on each other all the time. But then something shifted again. The calls became more demanding. If I didn't answer right away, she'd call multiple times, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. She started keeping track of when I called and would comment if too many days had passed without contact. She'd guilt-trip me about being too busy for her, about forgetting about the person who raised me. She also started hinting that she was having financial problems. Nothing direct at first, just comments about how expensive everything was, how hard it was to manage on her own. Then she began asking if I could help out a little, just until she got back on her feet. I was working part-time at a campus coffee shop, barely making enough to cover my own expenses, but I sent her what I could. The money requests became more frequent. Emergency car repairs, unexpected medical bills, problems with the house that needed immediate attention. Each time, she'd promise it was just temporary, just until she could sort things out. I started picking up extra shifts, eating ramen for dinner most nights, skipping social events because I couldn't afford them. My friends noticed I was stressed, always worried about money, always rushing to answer phone calls. When they'd ask what was going on, I'd make excuses. I was embarrassed to admit that my mother was depending on me financially, embarrassed that I couldn't seem to say no to her requests for help. The breaking point came during finals week of my junior year. I was stressed about exams, working extra hours to make rent, and she called in hysterics about some crisis that required immediate financial help. When I explained that I couldn't send money right then, that I was barely making it myself, she completely lost it. She screamed about how selfish I was, how I'd forgotten everything she'd done for me, how I was abandoning her just like everyone else in her life. That call lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of her crying, yelling, guilting, and manipulating. I missed a study group I'd planned to attend. I was exhausted, and I felt like I was drowning. After I finally hung up, I sat in my dorm room and realized that nothing had really changed. The dynamic was the same as it had always been. Everything was about her needs, her feelings, her problems. Update 2. Junior year ended, and I decided not to go home for the summer. Instead, I got a full-time job at a local restaurant and took a couple of summer classes. I told her I needed to stay on campus for school, which was partly true, but really I just needed space to think. The summer was incredible. I worked hard, made good money, hung out with friends who stayed in town, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But she didn't take my absence well. The phone calls became more intense, more frequent. She'd call crying about how lonely she was, how she couldn't understand why I didn't want to come home. She started sending care packages filled with things I didn't need or want, always with notes about how much she missed me and how she was just trying to take care of me. Then the letters started coming. Long, handwritten letters that would arrive every few days. At first, they seemed sweet. Updates about the neighborhood, memories of when I was younger, expressions of love and pride. But they were also weird in their intensity. She'd write about how I was the most important thing in her life, how she lived for our phone calls, how she spent her days thinking about me and waiting to hear from me. The letters got longer and more rambling. She'd write about her dreams, her regrets, her hopes for our future relationship. She'd talk about how she imagined us spending time together when I graduated, maybe traveling, maybe me moving back home for a while to save money. She'd write about how she was learning to cook new things she thought I'd like, how she was redecorating my old room to make it more comfortable for when I visited. Reading these letters made me feel sick to my stomach, though I couldn't exactly explain why. There was something suffocating about her love, something that felt more about her needs than about actually caring for me as a person. She seemed to have created this fantasy version of our relationship in her head, and she was trying to make me play along with it. My senior year started, and I threw myself into my studies and my part-time job. I was majoring in communications and had landed an internship at a local radio station. The work was interesting, the people were cool, and for the first time, I could see a possible career path opening up in front of me. I started making plans for after graduation, looking at entry-level positions in different cities, thinking about where I wanted to live and work. But every conversation with her became about what I was going to do after college. She had it all figured out in her mind. I'd move back home, live with her while I looked for a job, and we'd be this close mother-son team. When I'd mention looking at opportunities in other cities, she'd get upset and talk about how she'd been looking forward to having me back, how she'd been planning for us to spend more time together. The manipulation became more sophisticated. She'd bring up my childhood, talking about how she'd sacrificed so much for me, how she'd always put my needs first. She'd get emotional about how fast time was passing, how she was getting older and wouldn't be around forever. She'd hint about health problems, always vague, always just serious enough to make me worry, but never specific enough for me to actually help. Around Christmas of my senior year, I came home for a short visit. The house felt like a shrine to me. She had framed pictures of me everywhere, on the mantle, on the refrigerator, on her nightstand. My old room had been completely redone with new furniture, new bedding, new curtains. It looked like a guest room in a hotel, sterile and impersonal despite being decorated supposedly for me. She'd planned activities for every day I was there. Museums I'd never expressed interest in, restaurants she thought I'd like, movies she wanted us to see together. She'd made a whole itinerary and was hurt when I wanted to spend time with old friends or just relax. Every activity felt forced, like she was trying to create these perfect mother-son memories that we'd never actually had. The whole visit felt performative. She'd take pictures constantly, always asking me to smile, always wanting to document how much fun we were having together. She'd post them on social media with captions about her wonderful son and how proud she was of the man I'd become. But it all felt fake, like she was trying to convince the world, and maybe herself, that we had this amazing relationship. The most unsettling part was how she'd touch me constantly, hugging me goodbye every time I left the house, even if I was just going to the store, holding my hand when we walked places, stroking my hair when we watched TV together. Physical affection had never been part of our relationship when I was growing up, and now suddenly she couldn't keep her hands off me. It made me deeply uncomfortable, but when I'd try to create some space, she'd get hurt and emotional. I cut that visit short, claiming I had to get back for work. The look of devastation on her face when I told her I was leaving early was something I'll never forget. She cried, begged me to stay longer, promised we could do whatever I wanted if I'd just give her more time. I felt guilty leaving, but I also felt like I was suffocating. Back at school, I started avoiding her calls more often. When we did talk, I'd keep the conversation short and surface level. I stopped telling her details about my life, my friends, my plans. Something inside me was pulling back, trying to create distance, even though I couldn't fully explain why. That's when I started noticing things that didn't add up. She'd reference conversations we'd supposedly had that I couldn't remember. She'd bring up plans we'd allegedly made together that I had no memory of making. She'd talk about promises I'd supposedly given her about staying in touch or visiting more often. It was like she was living in a completely different reality from the one I was experiencing. The final semester of college was stressful for normal reasons: job applications, thesis deadlines, figuring out post-graduation life. But it was made infinitely more stressful by her constant pressure and emotional demands. Every phone call was a negotiation about my future. Every conversation was loaded with expectations and guilt. Then came the day that changed everything. I was home for what I thought would be my last visit before graduation. She'd asked me to help her organize some paperwork in her bedroom: taxes, insurance documents, that kind of thing. She'd stepped out to make coffee, and I was going through a drawer full of old bills and receipts when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a letter, handwritten in her unmistakable handwriting, dated just a few months after I was born. It was addressed to the Department of Social Services, and it was a formal request to have me removed from her care and placed in foster care. Final update. I sat on her bed, holding that letter with shaking hands, reading it over and over again. The words were burned into my brain. I don't want this child. He's from him. He destroyed my life. Please come take him away. I can't do this anymore. I never wanted to be a mother. This was a mistake, and I want to fix it. The letter went on for 2 pages, detailing how unprepared she was for motherhood, how she resented being tied down, how she blamed me for ruining her youth and her chances at happiness. She wrote about how she looked at me and saw only problems, only burdens, only reminders of a relationship that had gone wrong. She begged them to find me a good family, saying she was doing what was best for both of us. There was another document in the same folder, a response from social services, explaining that voluntary surrender required certain steps and asking her to come in for counseling and evaluation. There were appointment cards, all unmarked, and then nothing. Apparently, she'd never followed through with the process. I heard her footsteps coming up the stairs, and I quickly put everything back where I'd found it. But I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. 22 years of my life suddenly made perfect sense. The coldness, the resentment, the constant message that I was unwanted. It wasn't just stress or immaturity or difficult circumstances. It was genuine, deep-seated rejection that had been there from the very beginning. She came back into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee, chattering about something, and I just stared at her. This woman who had been calling me constantly, sending care packages, writing long letters about how much she loved me. She had literally tried to give me away as a baby. Everything about our recent relationship felt like a lie, like she was trying to rewrite history to make herself feel better about what she'd done. I made an excuse about not feeling well and left that day. The 3-hour drive back to school was a blur of anger, hurt, and strange relief. Finally, I understood. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't imagining things, I wasn't being too sensitive. The message I'd received my entire childhood was accurate. She really hadn't wanted me. But here's the thing that took me longer to understand. The recent change in her behavior wasn't because she'd suddenly learned to love me. She was getting older, facing the reality of being alone, and she'd decided that having a devoted son was better than having no one at all. The love bombing, the constant contact, the guilt trips about spending time together, it was all about her fear of abandonment, not about actually caring for me as a person. I graduated a few weeks later. She came to the ceremony, took pictures, acted like the proud mother. I went through the motions, but inside I felt completely disconnected from her. After graduation, I moved to a city about 6 hours away and got a job at a radio station. I didn't tell her my exact address, just the general area. The phone calls continued, but I started answering them less frequently. When I did talk to her, I kept things very surface level. I didn't share details about my job, my apartment, my dating life, my friends. She'd push for more information, but I learned to deflect and change the subject. She started showing up unannounced. The first time, she drove 6 hours to surprise me at work, showing up at the radio station with flowers and talking about how she wanted to take me to lunch. It was humiliating and invasive, and I had to explain to my coworkers later why my mother seemed so intense and emotional about everything. After that incident, I had a serious conversation with her about boundaries. I told her she couldn't just show up at my workplace, that she needed to call before visiting, that I needed space to build my adult life. She cried, said she was just trying to be supportive, that she missed me so much she couldn't help herself. But the surprise visits continued. She'd drive to my city and then call from a hotel, saying she was already there and hoping we could spend time together. She'd show up at restaurants where I'd told her I liked to eat, hoping to run into me. She started following me on social media and would comment on everything I posted, usually with overly emotional responses that embarrassed me in front of friends and coworkers. The breaking point came about a year after graduation. I was dating someone seriously for the first time, and I'd been very careful not to mention it to her because I knew she'd want to meet them immediately and would probably scare them off with her intensity. But somehow she found out, probably through social media stalking, and showed up at a restaurant where we were having dinner. She approached our table, introduced herself to my girlfriend, and started crying about how she was so happy to finally meet the woman who was making her son so happy. My girlfriend was sweet about it, but later she asked me why my mother seemed so desperate and why I'd never mentioned her before. That's when I realized I was going to have to make some serious decisions about how much of a relationship I wanted to have with her. I started seeing someone, not a therapist exactly, but a counselor at work who helped employees deal with stress and personal issues. I told him about the letter, about the childhood emotional abuse, about the current boundary violations. He helped me understand that what I was dealing with wasn't normal family drama. It was a pattern of manipulation and control that had been going on my entire life. The hardest part was accepting that she probably wasn't going to change. The woman who had written that letter when I was a baby, asking to have me taken away, was the same woman who was now desperately trying to make me the center of her emotional world. Both versions of her were real, and both were about her needs rather than about what was actually best for me. I made the decision to go very low contact. I'd talk to her maybe once a month, keep conversations short, and not engage with any emotional manipulation or guilt trips. I blocked her on social media. I didn't give her my new address when I moved apartments, and I made it clear that surprise visits were not acceptable. She didn't take it well. The phone calls became more frantic, the letters more desperate. She'd call crying about how she was losing me, how she'd made mistakes but she loved me so much now, how she couldn't understand why I was punishing her for things that happened so long ago. She'd promised to change, to give me space, to respect my boundaries, but then she'd violate those same boundaries within days. The guilt was intense. Part of me felt like maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should try harder to have a relationship with her. She was getting older. She seemed genuinely distressed, and wasn't forgiveness supposed to be healing? But every time I'd soften and give her more access to my life, the same patterns would emerge. The neediness, the manipulation, the assumption that my life should revolve around making her feel better about herself. About 2 years after college, I met someone who became really important to me. We started living together, and I had to explain why my mother wasn't part of our lives, why she wasn't invited to holidays or celebrations. My partner was understanding but also helped me see how abnormal the whole situation was. In their family, people had normal boundaries, normal conflicts, normal ways of working through problems. They didn't understand why my mother's love felt so suffocating and conditional. That's when I realized something crucial. I wasn't her mistake, and I wasn't responsible for fixing the damage that her choices had created. The baby she tried to give away had grown up into a person who could make his own decisions about relationships and boundaries. I didn't owe her forgiveness. I didn't owe her access to my life. And I certainly didn't owe her the kind of devoted son relationship she seemed to want now. The last real conversation we had was about 3 years ago. She called on my birthday, which had become our pattern. She'd call on holidays and birthdays, and I'd answer because it felt too cruel not to. But this time, instead of the usual birthday wishes, she started talking about how lonely she was, how she'd been thinking about the past, how she wanted us to start over and build the relationship we should have had all along. Something in me snapped. I told her I'd found the letter, the one where she'd asked to have me taken away as a baby. There was this long silence, and then she started crying and trying to explain. She said she was young, she was scared, she didn't know what she was doing. She said she'd changed, that she'd learned to love being a mother, that those feelings were from a different time in her life. But here's what I told her, and it's something I'd been thinking about for years. It didn't matter if she'd changed. The damage was done. I'd spent my entire childhood believing I was unwanted because I was unwanted. I'd spent 22 years trying to earn love from someone who had literally tried to give me away. The fact that she regretted it now, the fact that she wanted a relationship now, didn't erase the reality of what my childhood had been like. I told her I didn't hate her, but I also didn't want her in my life anymore. I told her I hoped she could find peace and happiness, but it wasn't going to be through me. I told her I was done trying to be the son she wanted now to make up for the son she hadn't wanted then. She kept calling for a while after that, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to heartbroken. Eventually, the call stopped. I heard through some distant relatives that she was doing okay, that she'd moved to a different state, that she seemed to be building a life for herself. I'm 30 now, married to that person who helped me understand what healthy relationships look like. We have a good life together, surrounded by friends who feel like chosen family. I work in media, doing something I love, making enough money to be comfortable. I wake up most mornings feeling grateful for the life I've built. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about reaching out to her, if I miss having a mother, if I regret cutting contact. The honest answer is complicated. I do sometimes wonder how she's doing, and there's a part of me that will always grieve for the mother I never had. But I don't miss the anxiety, the guilt, the constant feeling that I wasn't doing enough to make someone else happy. I learned that love isn't supposed to feel like drowning. Healthy relationships don't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. The people who really care about you want you to be happy and successful, even if that means spending less time with them. I wasn't her mistake. I was a child who deserved to be wanted and loved unconditionally. The fact that she couldn't provide that love wasn't my fault then, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix it later. I survived her rejection once as a baby, and I survived it again as an adult when I chose to walk away. The kid who grew up believing he was unwanted learned something important. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to earn love from people who aren't capable of giving it freely. I found my worth somewhere else, with people who see me as a gift rather than a burden. That's my story. I hope anyone reading this who recognizes their own situation knows that you deserve better than conditional love, and it's okay to walk away from relationships that make you feel small, even when those relationships are with family. You're not obligated to keep someone in your life just because they share your DNA or because they claim to love you now. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save yourself.